Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a peacock in pastels. Now this video is going to focus on how to draw those bright iridescent feathers and how to keep those colours nice and bright. But before I can get onto that, I do want to start off with the eye first. Now this is where I like to start all of my portraits. This is where the main emotion and expression stems from, so I just like to make sure that I've got these in place first. Now when I work with the eyes, if you've got a really bright highlight in the eye, then it's always worth using a little bit of a white Carbothello pencil first and mapping in that highlight initially. You can always darken that up later on if you need to, but just knowing that you've got the brightest pastel in first means that you've got that bright contrast all from the very beginning. Now this colour wheel here, I'm just explaining to my Patreon members in the real-time step-by-step tutorial how to pick the pencils that we've got in front of us. Depending on what that reference photo is showing with the colours, there are many different pencils that we could choose, but knowing which ones to layer together to get that colour can be quite overwhelming. So I've got a very simple colour wheel system that I like to use that really helps to limit the amount of pencils that we can choose from, so it does make that colour selection process far easier. If you would like to see that or any other aspect of my real-time tutorials, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. Now the tiny little details that I'm adding here, again, this is all about hyping up that contrast. I'm making sure that I've got the areas really dark for my base layers if they need it. Now this is going to be a main priority throughout all of this lesson. In order to create that bright colour, that iridescent sheen on the feathers, the contrast is the most important thing. It's not necessarily the colour that's going to influence that, it's the values. So I need to be making sure that I've got the shadows really dark and then my highlights nice and bright as well. Now that's going to become more apparent as we work more on the feathers in that larger area of the neck and the top of the head. But I really do want to be paying attention to where exactly the lights and the darks are. Now the highlights and shadows, they're not random. They follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. Now something else that follows the underlying bone and muscular structure is the feather direction. Now this would be the same with drawing fur, and I do have a video here on YouTube that shows my top tips for drawing realistic fur, and all of that can also be applied when drawing feathers, so I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But the feather direction, as you can see from that one area just to the right hand side of the eye, I'm always moving my pencil there from left to right. They're not going on a diagonal or from top to bottom. And this is really important because if we get this wrong, then we could potentially change the shape of the skull, and that's of course then going to not resemble that species of bird in the same way that it should. So that is something to pay very close attention to. Now one way that I like to make sure that I'm focusing on all of the feather direction accurately is by breaking it up into very small sections. So as you can see here, it's one tiny element at a time, maybe even just an inch. That enables me to then focus on getting that about 80% complete before I can move on. Now drawing feathers, it can be a little bit more overwhelming because of how they overlap and there are so many to draw. So by breaking it up into small sections like this, it just means that we work more effectively and more efficiently. Now in terms of the layering process, as you can see, I'm really building up a good base foundation. I'm starting to soften in between the lights and the darks to avoid any harsh edges. Now this is what I like to do regardless of the animal that I'm drawing, and I've got lots of videos here on YouTube that show many different animals that are, fur, feathers, whatever it may be, but the base layers are always nice and blended. I find that this makes it far easier to then add in our details on top. Now I mentioned at the beginning of this video about how I'm going to focus on drawing those iridescent feathers, and contrast plays that role. You can see here that I'm coming back in with my highlights, but they only look bright because I've got my layers underneath nice and dark. So if you're drawing a bird where you've got these bright colours in place with that iridescent shine and you're finding that it looks a little bit flat, then the contrast is probably what's happening. Now that's not just with iridescent feathers, that will be with anything. If you're drawing a dog and you feel like you need to get a little bit more of that depth within the fur, it's usually an indication that the darks need to be darkened and your highlights need to be brightened. Now quite often it's the darker values that are lacking because we're worried about going too dark and then not being able to lighten it. So usually that is more the case than the highlights being an issue, but it is just something to pay attention to. Now something that I speak about thoroughly in all of my tutorials, both on Patreon and here on YouTube, is the importance of the subtle layers. Now, as you can see here, for that first layer, I've used my darkest black pencil that I have. That's quite a bold decision, but it's very important in order to capture that iridescent shine. Now, although I've got a really dark layer in, those blue pencils that I overlapped on top, they still showed up. Now, that's because the pastel is being applied in the right way. I haven't been too heavy-handed with it. I've made sure that I've still got lots of tooth of the paper left. But if any part of the process where you feel like your midtones and your highlights should look brighter, but they're just lacking, that's a really, really good indication that your base layers aren't dark enough. Now, of course, here I know that that's not the case because I've got that black in place, but I want to be making sure, as always, that I'm paying attention to the subtle values. So if I zoom into my reference photo and I noticed even just a hint of some detail, I'll try to replicate that in that area. Because what that will do is it will help to build up that overall three-dimensional look of even the darkest aspects of that portrait. Now, however, what's really important is if you're working from a good quality photo and the shadow looks really dark, you can't see any detail there, then that's fine to leave it as it is. There will be some sections on that black at the base of the neck that I leave just black. There'll be no feathers, and as you can see from the photo of my drawing in the corner, that's okay. That's what helps to build up the look of that three-dimensional shape. And you'll notice that all of this has been achieved just by using the pastel pencils. I haven't used pan pastels or soft pastel sticks for that base layer. Now, of course, you could, that's absolutely fine, but I wanted to show that you can create a highly detailed, realistic portrait just with the pencils alone, and that you don't have to have all of the pastel supplies. Now, regarding the supplies, the one thing that's going to make the most difference to working with pastels is not just the techniques that we're using, but the paper that we're drawing on. Having the right paper that allows for these techniques is crucial. Now, my paper of choice is Pastelmat because it allows for lots of layers. You get beautiful colour saturation, as you can see, and it really grips that pastel. That enables you to create many, many layers, which is needed for these highly detailed portraits. And this section of the neck, it really does demonstrate that perfectly. I've got 3 or 4 layers that I'm building up here, and this is just my base foundation. If I was working with a paper that was smoother, I wouldn't be able to get this same technique in place. So the paper, it's so important with pastels. The pencils are more forgiving, but the paper, it certainly is what makes the most difference. Now, at the beginning of this video, I did mention about how important it is to get the direction of the feathers right. So the way that we're moving that pencil is crucial. And as I start to build up the initial layer of detail here, you can see how that starts to become more apparent. So I'm really focusing on the direction of those feathers. It's starting to look a little bit more ruffled up as well, but also the length of my pencil strokes have increased. Now, this would be the case when drawing anything. So let's take a Labrador or a German Shepherd. The fur on the face is going to be significantly shorter than that on the chest, and this is exactly the same that's being replicated here. The longer pencil strokes is going to help to build up more of that feather texture and a different texture, so that again my portrait is going to look more three-dimensional and not flat. Now, one thing that also needs to be considered is how much detail can be applied for the size of the portrait we're creating. Now, this was an 8 by 8 inch, so it's not massive, but despite that, there's still a lot of detail. Now, that's mainly because I'm using the right layering process and the right pencil technique, but I'm also being aware of not to add too many details. So the feathers on the neck, they look ruffled up, but if I was to add another selection of feathers there, I'm going to end up losing the definition between each of my lines. Now, if you're working on a much larger scale, then you can add even more pencil strokes, many, many more. But we do want to be very aware when working on a smaller scale not to overdo it, because overdoing it, you're going to end up with maybe layers becoming blended, they're going to get too soft, because everything becomes merged together. Now, throughout this video, I've mentioned the importance of working with a darker base layer. However, there are times where I'll be working and I'll feel, I don't actually have that base layer as dark as I should have. And this can happen very, very easily. We'll work on our base foundation and think that at that time it's okay. But if you start working with your highlights and you feel like your highlights are not showing up, but they should be, that is an indication that you need to go in and darken those base layers, which is what I was just having to do on the last portion of the neck. Now, although those little alterations, they do add a few extra minutes, they are very important. It's all about hyping up that contrast wherever we can to increase the depth. Now, the very last thing for this portrait was to add the feathers on the back of the head. Now these are quite unique. There are no other bird that I've seen that has feathers like this, so I hadn't actually drawn this before. But I wanted to approach it in exactly the same way as everything else. Individual layers and just doing one at a time. Now once I'd got the blue feathers in place and I was happy with the shape of those, I had to now attach them to the peacock's head. So these very fine lines that I'm drawing here, it's all about using the correct pencil technique. The pressure on the pencil for these fine lines is so important. Very minimal pressure is what we need to be using, and any extra pressure is going to create very thick, chunky lines, which we want to avoid. That's going to make it look more rigid. We're not going to have the same softness to it. Now in terms of those lines, even here for the blue feathers, they're no straight lines, they're all curved. And this is something that I really wanted to make sure to get right, because straight lines are going to give you more of that flatter two-dimensional look. So look as well how they're separated. They're not blocks of feathers. I haven't just outlined them. I've made sure to draw individual lines with each cluster of feather that I've drawn. And as always, I've broken it up into one tiny section at a time, one feather at a time if needed. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If you would like to draw along to the real-time tutorial of this peacock, then that is available now on my Patreon channel. As I said, with a step-by-step voiceover while I'm drawing, so every single process is explained thoroughly in the moment. So I really do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video here to YouTube at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.